Hey guys, in this podcast we talk about different health topics. As we are not medical experts, we ask for you to check with your doctor first before using any information provided in this podcast. Furthermore, we talk about third-party views in this podcast. Please know that we have no intention of misrepresenting these views, and we apologize in advance if we do so. Thanks.
Hey guys, what's up? Paul here, and today we are going to be kind of doing a continuation of the Is It Reasonable to Believe in God? But today I want to take a different perspective. Before, in the Reasonable to Believe in God, I offered different uh, theist perspectives and arguments for the existence of God. Today I want to focus more on the atheist arguments. Like, who are the forerunners of new atheism? And what are their arguments? And what are strong atheist arguments that are hard for Christians to answer? And so today that's what I want to start with. So I want to talk a little bit about Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, because right now I view those two as kind of the forefathers, front runners of the atheist movement right now,
Yeah,
and the popular atheist movement, I would have to say.
Yeah, another thing we should kind of say first is we're not necessarily associated with like one side, like atheism or Christianity. We're just debating the different opinions of others.
Yeah.
So
In the academic arena, Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris aren't very credible sources.
Really?
They aren't taken very seriously because most of their arguments have holes in their logic or have been refuted years ago. Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris both are very popular atheists who write popular books, and many people use their arguments. So today I want to kind of go over some of their arguments, show you how they're not that strong, but then also like tell you like what are the strong atheist arguments, like what are theists at the highest levels of philosophy getting stuck on,
Gotcha.
or what are atheists like really pushing. And I'll show you that pop science, although interesting, does not necessarily have that much credibility in the logical sphere.
okay, let's get down
So
to
I'm going to jump right into Richard Dawkins. So Richard Dawkins is a biologist from Oxford University. I don't believe he still teaches there, and he's done some brilliant work in biology, particularly on bats and how bats have evolved and stuff. But he's kind of jumped him into the philosophical region, and he's one of the most dogmatic leaders of this new atheist movement. He'll say stuff like, religion causes war, religion causes doubt, like all these different things. He's very dogmatic that God doesn't exist and that you shouldn't believe in God. And he is that way because he has arguments which he believes refute the existence of God, but which I'll show you why particularly he is not taken very seriously in the academic field. So I'm going to put up an argument on the screen for you guys because it's pretty long and I don't want to read it all out.
Yeah.
But when you're looking at this argument, read the premises and then look at the conclusion. What you'll see is that the conclusion kind of just comes out from left field. What I discussed in the Reasonable to Believe in God is that in logic, there's certain rules that you have to look at. First off, a sound argument obeys the rules of logic. Its premises are true, and its premises are more probable than alternatives. But the other thing you have to remember is that premises lead to a conclusion that follows necessarily. And in the case of this argument, you can see that the premises, even if true, it does not follow that his conclusion is also true. So let me just talk about what his conclusion is. His conclusion is, where is it?
Yeah, I think the other thing that just for those who are listening just via audio for this, is there a way we could like maybe sum it up for them really quick? I know it's hard.
No, really not. Just there's too many premises.
Okay,
So let me.
gotcha.
So let's just go back to it. So he concludes that a God must not exist because of these lists of the things that I've given. So, but let's just look at. I mentioned that the first flaw in this is that it doesn't follow in this. His conclusion doesn't follow from the premises.
Okay.
And so that is one of the main reasons why he's not taken very seriously, because his arguments are not logically coherent. So,
Okay.
But I want to get into a couple other of his points. So one of his points is, number 3. He says, if God created the universe, then who created God? And I've talked a little bit about this before. But this sort of logic is very flawed because we don't need an explanation for an explanation in the scientific process. So let me explain that with an example.
Yeah.
So let's say you're an archaeologist and you find plates, like you dig up plates and stuff.
Right.
It's reasonable for you to infer that someone must have created those plates, and that's why they're there.
Right.
But you don't have to then explain how the person who created the plates got there for you to make the inference on how the plates got there.
Oh,
Does that make
right,
sense?
yeah.
So what ends up happening with this type of logic is that you have an infinite regress of explanations. You just would
Okay.
keep going back, well, what caused that? What's the explanation for that? And what's the explanation for that? So I briefly talked about this before, but with the argument of contingency and the idea that God must exist out of necessity, we are saying that if you go, you can't just keep infinitely regressing, that there has to be a maximally powerful being at the end of it. And that's, if you want to hear more about that argument, then you should listen to our other podcast. So I don't want to get too much into that today.
Okay.
But basically, this idea that we need to prove why God exists for us to say that God created the universe is just not true, because it would destroy the whole scientific process, because you would have an infinite redress
Yeah, so you're saying
of explanations.
the problem is that if you just say, well, then what caused that or what caused that, the problem is that you can never actually answer that question through a scientific process, because there's no way that something can just come out of nothing in
Right.
science. And so you're saying that it's not illogical to say that.
God created, and you don't have to give an explanation to how God got there, because God actually, by definition, is the most contingent, a being that exists out of necessary from a contingent source.
Yeah.
So that's sort of a problem with number 3 on the list. Now, another thing that he kind of concludes from this is that he's like, how can a God who is more complex, like anything that creates something else must be more complex than the thing that's been created.
Okay.
So a person can only build a computer
Which is less
that
complex.
is less complex than the person. But
No.
that's what he's arguing. Okay, so that's
No.
the problem. So what
Okay.
you're why this is a problem, because of the composition fallacy.
Okay.
Something can be simple in its parts but complex as a whole.
And I also think the other thing, how do you define complexity as well?
Right. So that's a big problem. So God could be more complex. I mean, he could be less complex, because ultimately the universe is just a compilation of a bunch of simple things together, and
Yeah.
God is just more complex than those simple things.
Yeah.
And so you run into this whole problem of like ambiguousness around complexity.
Right.
And then the second thing is that God is immaterial, and an immaterial being behaves much differently than a material being. So this whole complexity thing doesn't necessarily apply to a very complex but simple immaterial being, because ultimately the most complex being is one that is very simple.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to, I want to just jump in on this, and I don't know if this will help you out or not, but when we talk about complexity in terms of like in a science realm, we usually talk about information, and the agent against organized information is entropy, which I think you guys probably should know about. But the whole point is that there's no way you can actually judge whether certain amounts of information are more complex than other sorts of information. So I don't even know how you would judge complexity in the first place.
Yeah.
And to say that like a human could not create something more complex than the human itself, well, we do that every day.
Yeah, and we do that all the time. And the thing is that we can create something more complex than ourselves, because we create simple things that compile to make something.
Yeah.
There's like the composition fallacy is basically like, if you're at a baseball stadium and one person stands up, it might be beneficial to them. But if everyone stands up, then no one can see.
Yeah, one thing I want to just say too as well is like, humans, I guess, created supercomputers, right? And a lot of supercomputers now can identify cats through these extremely complex algorithms. They can even read letters from MRI. Like if you think about the word like bat, for example, an MRI machine and the supercomputer can understand that you are thinking the word BAT. So what I'm trying to say is that the algorithms to do that are far more complex than what you yourself can think of.
Yeah.
You would never be able to think of that blow by blow algorithm.
Yeah.
So that's just a minor example of how more complex something
That doesn't imply, yeah. So that just shows more how the logic is flawed.
Right.
So like what we can see is that these premises, even if true, it doesn't follow, the conclusion doesn't follow necessarily. So we have a flaw in logic, but we'll give Dawkins the benefit of the doubt and just say that, these steps or whatever, these sequences are more just steps, like staircases to arrive at the end position, and that he didn't intend for this to be a logical argument.
Okay.
We'll just give him the benefit of the doubt. So
Okay.
we give him that benefit of the doubt, but we've already shown that 2 of the premises are incredibly weak.
Right.
And like who created God is not a question that's debated among the top philosophers anymore,
Okay.
and not ever really. And then the complexity thing. And then the rest of the argument is basically like a God to fill the gaps argument, where you say, we don't know, like the people didn't know that the sun was the center of the universe, so they thought
Right.
that the earth was the center of the universe. But then science made more discoveries, and people realized that they were wrong.
Right.
This argument is sort of saying that people do the same thing. Like when they don't know something, they just say God did it.
Right.
But we haven't given science enough time to answer it. And this argument is very flawed, because for one, theists use science in their premises to conclude the conclusions they're making. And secondly, we realize that science fills the gaps. If people use science to fill the gaps, just like they use God to fill the gaps.
Yeah,
So you
right.
say, well, we don't know the answer, but science will someday show us the answer.
Yeah, right. Or we'll say there's several theories, we haven't proved them yet, but
Yeah.
they could solve this. They could solve the same
Yeah,
answer.
and
for
so
us.
ultimately we can prove anything with this sort of argument.
Yeah.
But you have to realize that people believe in God not based solely on,
Just
on
emotional-
design and emotional
yeah.
reason, but theists have inferences that go beyond just that.
Yeah, so just to say this another way, basically we're saying you have to have faith in either one thing or another. You have to either have faith that
Science will fill the gaps.
that science will fill the gaps, or God will fill the gaps. Because
But it's not. They're not contradictory. So
Yeah.
just because you believe in God doesn't mean that science can't fill the gaps. It
Right.
just means that God is behind science. Because like I said last podcast, we should look at science as a means to understand God's creation.
Okay.
If you are a theist.
Yeah.
And so there's no like, science is right, religion's right conflict here. The conflict isn't there. It's just like Dawkins is accusing theists of using God to fill the gaps when
Right.
it's just not the case. God is not filling the gaps. And ultimately, this argument just can lead to any conclusions that you want to make.
Yeah.
Because you just say, well, science hasn't proved it yet.
I think a lot of people, though, they tend to say, God kind of excused a lot of things in the past, like explained how we got here, and then through science, slowly but surely, it started to replace what God just magically did overnight, or in 7 days or whatever. So I think that they say that pattern will continue down, so that everything that we don't know about will eventually just be a science explanation.
Like when you look at history, people used to attribute everything, like the wind blowing, to God.
Yeah.
Now, there's nothing wrong with that, because if God did create the universe, then it's a byproduct of a series of reactions that has caused the wind to blow. It's a byproduct of God creating the universe.
Right.
But yeah, as we've progressed more, we start to see that like how things work scientifically. But we want to see science as understanding the way that God created the world. So God could be behind it, but we still can probably understand it logically as human beings. So that kind of gets into that. Now, another thing I want to do with Richard Dawkins is kind of like in the reasonable to believe in God, I brought up a couple different arguments that theists make that are strong arguments. One was a cosmological, two was a moral argument, and three was a teleological. And we could talk about the ontological argument, although I omitted that from the last one, and that's a pretty complicated one.
You're blowing my mind, Paul.
Okay. So, but at being a forerunner for the atheist movement, it's important that Richard Dawkins, discusses the strongest arguments that theists have. And he does this, but he does it very poorly.
Okay.
So the cosmological argument basically goes that anything that exists had to begin to exist, because nothing can't become something. To say that that's possible is to say that magic. It's just believe in magic, basically.
Yeah, even a lot of people argue like quantum mechanics can appear, like something can appear from like space, and like you have these different quantum
so in a
interactions.
vacuum you see spontaneous particles come into existence,
and then they come out of existence,
and then they come, so it appears as though they're coming out of nothing, but what you forget is that the vacuum is an energy field and it's coming from energy. So that's often a common argument that's easily refuted, because a vacuum is not nothing,
right? And the vacuum, really what's coming from is space-time, which actually is something. And if you go into quantum mechanics, you actually learn that a lot of things that we see is only like 4% of our universe. The other 96 we can't even explain or observe. So that's another issue. But
so basically, we're saying that the first premises is that like anything that begins to exist must have a cause or something, and no one refutes that. Everyone believes that. The next one is the universe began to exist. And I talked about the scientific evidence with like singularity, Stephen Hawking's black holes, and the multiple infinite regression, and why the universe must have had a cause and must not exist infinitely. But if you want to listen to that, go back to the other podcast, because we cover that more thoroughly.
The bottom line is you're saying that the universe could not have existed for an unlimited amount of time. Yeah. Okay.
And so then we conclude that therefore God must have created the universe.
Oh, okay. Because if there was,
because there must be a cause, and there must out of necessity there must be a cause, and it must be therefore be God.
Right, but then you argue about the nature of God. Like it doesn't have to be necessarily emotional.
Okay, so that's what Richard Dawkins does. Yeah. So he doesn't refute this argument. All this argument intends is to prove the existence of God. Yeah. It doesn't intend to attribute any qualities to God. Okay. So instead of refuting this argument, which is one of the strongest theist arguments, Richard Dawkins then appeals to the attributes. He's like, well, just because this is true, it doesn't mean that God can listen to your prayers or that he's a personal God. So he completely avoids and attacks a straw man when this argument had no intentions of, describing the attributes of God. So he attacks a straw man, which obviously is a sign of weakness in a debate. So the first thing you see that he cannot attack this argument, he instead attacks a weaker version of the argument that's not even intended.
Okay, so the whole argument was just supposed to show that God does exist, not that he's emotional or anything, but then Dawkins is saying, well, he's not.
Yeah,
so he's not emotional.
He's not. He's not denying any of the premises or attacking the argument at hand. He's only attacking a straw man, which a straw man is basically creating a different problem and then answer a different problem that's easy to answer and then coming up with an answer to it. Okay. But not the real problem at hand.
Gotcha.
So that's sort of his failure to address the cosmological argument is a big problem people have with him. The second one is the moral argument. So the moral argument says that objective morals exist. If objective morals exist, then God exists. Therefore,
Well,
objective morals and God both exist. It goes something like that. I can't say off the top of my head, but it's basically that we can only have objective morals with the existence of God. Okay.
Oh, okay. So there's subjective morals, like I think that it's wrong to steal, but that's just my opinion.
Yeah. So
and then objective is like it is wrong to steal. I mean, I don't know if that's
so. Let me read a quote from Dawkins on this topic. So he says, "There is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference." Well, it's funny because Dawkins writes a lot about what are good morals and what are bad morals. Like, he was mortified of Enron's executive with that whole thing. He hates like discrimination towards like
segregation of people.
All sorts of stuff. He hates all that stuff, and he's very dogmatic about how this stuff's wrong. But at the end of the day, believes in subjective morals. So why should his opinion hold any more value than the opinions of the people doing it? Because it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So all I'm really pointing out is his hypocrisy. He's going to go preach that like these are good values and stuff, but then he's going to hold a view that there's no such thing as objective morals.
Okay,
and he also another thing that he does is he says, well, how can we judge goodness? How can we say this act is better than this act? Now this is attacking another straw man, because the moral argument doesn't try to say that one action is better than another and that we know what these actions are. That's moral epistemology, which is a completely different thing. The moral argument is focused on moral ontology, which is whether or not objective values and duties exist. And so he attacks the straw man of epistemology, and this is really common among atheists.
Okay, so just to recap here for us listening. So you're saying that there are subjective morals and objective morals. Mm-hmm. The subjective morals don't necessarily have more value than another subjective moral.
Yeah.
And an objective moral, though, would have some value because it's objective.
Yeah, it's objective. So you're saying that, like, had Nazi Germany won the war and brainwashed everyone, then their actions were not wrong because no one believes them to be wrong, because its morals are totally subjective and they're not separate from humankind.
Okay, and by Dawkins preaching certain things about discrimination,
he's being hypocritical because he is a self-proclaimed moral subjectivist.
And he's saying my subjective moral is greater than your subjective moral.
And so, like, why should anyone listen to him? Because their subjective morals, nothing has value. As he said, there's no meaning to anything. There's no purpose. There's no values.
So what's the point of him even preaching?
Yeah, so it's just we're just kind of pointing out his hypocrisy behind that.
Okay.
So I think then probably the most popular argument for the existence of God today is the teleological argument for the existence of God. And this is basically the argument that the universe is so finely tuned that there must have been a designer behind it. Like, when we look at the constants, like gravity, for example, and these formulas, they are constant. And the probability of these things, of a life-permitting universe existing with these constants, is so incredibly low.
Yeah, can I just jump in on this real quick?
Yeah.
Just from a science perspective, there are about 42 numbers or constants that we have identified through our most fundamental equations in physics that just seem to come out of nowhere. And we've been trying to explain these exact numbers, which go on for like more than 1 billion digits. They're very, very, very specific. And so we're at a loss right now to explain where did these constant numbers come from and why are they so correctly tuned to allow life to exist.
So basically, the way Dawkins handles this, because this is another big problem for an atheist, is he uses the multiverse thing. He says, well, he even says that it's unlikely that a multiverse exists, but that it's more likely than a God existing. And this is just pure conjecture to make that claim, because we can't, it's unfalsifiable whether or not a multiverse exists. But the idea behind the multiverse is we say it's so improbable that our universe is as finely tuned as it is, that there must be millions of other universes out there.
And each one has a specific finely tuned universe itself. And there are billions of different combinations, but the one combination that does allow life to exist in, we exist in.
Yeah.
And we notice it.
And the multiverse, it can be used to prove almost anything, because you can say, well, this it will happen because in one of the many universes, so it must. So like you get like a royal straight flush like 15 times in a row. You don't say like, oh, that guy cheated. You just say in one of the millions of universes, someone was going to get it 15 times in a row. Right. So it's basically just a device used to allow the probability to exist.
Think of it as like rolling die, and you have thousands and thousands of rolls. So eventually you'll get some absurd roll.
Yeah. And so like I discussed this in the last podcast, but you have sort of this problem with multiverses, and the fact that you have the problem of like the multiverse, like how did it get there?
Yeah.
So it faces the same problems. But more importantly, you have this mathematical equation by
the Drake equation?
I don't think it's the Drake equation. It's the it's on the top of my head.
Which
Guth-Vallaken theorem, which shows that any expanding body had to have a beginning at a point of singularity. And if you follow modern science right now, the general theory of the universe, that's accepted, is the idea that we started at a point of singularity. And this was most of this comes from the work of Hawkins and Valenkum working together.
Yeah.
So because in order for there to be infinite universes, there must have been an expanding universe, like multiverse expanding out there. You have to have finely tuned universes to have finely tuned universes, and you just run into all these problems. So basically my point is that Richard Dawkins says that it's more probable for the multiverse to exist than for God to exist, but it's pure conjecture.
It's pure conjecture. It's anyone's guess at this point.
So he doesn't refute in any sense the argument. He just presents a possibility and says because it's possible, therefore it must be true.
Right.
And so like a common theme you should see is that Dawkins really does not have strong arguments. Like most of his arguments are faith-based. And
it's a faith-based statement to say something is more probable than another without any evidence.
Without any evidence. So most of his stuff is faith-based. So you got to ask, why is he so dogmatic against religion? And I think that in order to understand it, you'd have to look more at the psychological aspect of it, that he's like a voice of atheism. But I don't want to get into that. But I want to cover one more Dawkins argument, and then we'll look at Sam Harris real quick. So the other area, and the area where Dawkins maybe has more expertise, is on like naturalism and evolution and stuff like that.
Okay.
So let me read this quote. So Dawkins makes the claim that the evidence of evolution reveals a universe without design.
Okay.
And I'm pretty sure this is either in the book The God Delusion or The Watchmaker.
Okay.
The Blind Watchmaker. And so he's making the claim that evolution reveals a universe without design. And this again is somewhat pure conjecture. So I'll explain why. So, in the debates of evolutionists versus creationism, there's certain points that that theologians like point to and stuff. Like you have like the mammalian eye, like the mammal eye, and how does it evolve? Because like how does it function at 5%? Like it's not a 5% eye doesn't do anything. So Richard Dawkins comes up with a way in which the 5% eye would be able to work.
Okay.
So the idea with evolution is that there's a lot of debate to whether there's a logical sequence from one step to another. So like if you rewound the clock, would everything end up the same as it is? Is there a step-by-step sequence from one species to another?
Well, now if not, you could say there's maybe multiple sets of evolution on thousands of different Goldilocks planets, and then we're in the one evolution set that it's a kind of like the same multiverse argument. But I mean, we have through the Kepler telescope identified thousands of different planets that are just like ours.
Yeah.
So
but like I think that it's probably pretty probable that there's life on other planets.
Yeah.
Based on this vastness of our universe. But my point is that there's a lot of debate to whether we can have logical sequences from one species to another. No one's debating, like no one intelligent is debating evolution here.
Yeah.
It's just whether or not God guided evolution or whether or not evolution was totally on its own.
Okay.
Now Thomas Huxley, who was called he was Darwin's bulldog. He was the guy who'd do all the arguments for him.
Yeah. He
made the point because he was agnostic. He was not atheist like Darwin. He made the point that God could have caused these mutations to occur at certain times to then create the world that has been created.
Or it could have been chance. That's just
he could have set the initial conditions that allow the evolution of a person to become the way it is.
Yeah.
So Dawkins' whole thing that we need to have a logical series is very important to naturalism because without a logical series from point A to point B, there's no way that we could have formed.
So you're saying with Darwin, or so with his argument, you're saying basically that everything has to be logically explained. There can be you have no room for error whatsoever.
Yeah.
Every scientific law must explain the exact transition of each species to another.
Yeah, and so he is stuck on this. While a theist can say, even if every sequence is explained, you can't show that God didn't set the initial conditions for this to happen.
Now, when you say initial conditions, what do you mean? Do you mean the initial?
He set the universe into motion, and then in a way that which we would evolve.
Okay, so from the Big Bang or whenever the universe,
from the Big Bang,
the
initial conditions were set.
Okay.
So it doesn't matter. So like a theist can argue that God intervened in the process of evolution and caused certain mutations, and that there might be skips in the logical sequence that aren't explainable. But it doesn't matter because even if there are, it's still fine. But so Dawkins argues, this is Dawkins' evidence for saying that evolution shows that God does not exist. So let me break down the logic of what he's doing. He's saying because it's possible that the mammalian eye or something could have formed through a logical sequence of evolution, therefore it's true.
I see what you're saying. You're saying because he can prove it through logic doesn't necessarily mean just because logic can explain it does not necessarily mean that logic is the answer.
Yeah, and it doesn't necessarily mean that God does not exist because even if he can't explain it, God can still exist. Yeah. So basically, a breakdown of his logic is basically like this. I'll give an example.
Okay.
So a husband comes home to his wife and is really excited. So the wife says, "Why are you so excited?" And the husband's like, "Well, I'm pretty sure I'm going to get a promotion from the president at the university." And the wife's like, oh, why? And he's like, well, it's possible that I might get a promotion, so I'm thinking I'm gonna get a promotion.
Oh, okay, I see. So you're saying
basically,
just because like maybe
just
science,
because something's possible does not allow you to then follow with the conclusion that
It
says
must
that
be.
it must be, and that evolution reveals a universe without design, which is ultimately what he says, because he doesn't have that evidence whatsoever. So this is just purely terrible logic.
Okay. Okay.
So we spent a lot of times on Dawkins, and I will tell you that like pretty much all of Dawkins' work has been dissected and destroyed. He is just not a reliable source. Now he's a smart guy and he's done a lot of good work, but this is just not his area.
Okay, and also for those who are listening to this, if your mind's blown by now, mine is too. I'm pretty fried right now. But let's move on to Sam Harris.
So Sam Harris is really popular right now. The book he wrote was called The Moral Landscape, in which he proposed a potential way in which objective morals could exist without God. So I talked about the moral argument earlier where I said like objective morals can't exist without God. Well, Sam Harris is going to say objective morals do exist with God. So let me explain.
Okay.
So Sam Harris discusses this value problem. This is like a problem. So like he says that like how can we judge like a good action from another? So he's like really focused on like the epistemology of moral values and stuff.
Okay.
But he comes up with this conclusion that we can have objective morals without God because we can say that anything that is good for our brain is good for all mankind.
Our brain?
Our brain. Like anything that's good for our well-being is objective. So when someone acts in the benefit of another person and it increases their well-being, that is an objectively moral action. That's what he's saying.
Okay, but I think there's a question about, is everyone's well-being of equal value then? Like, is the president's well-being the same value as my well-being?
Right, and so you're starting to already dissect problems with this type of argument.
Okay.
So his argument in philosophy is very similar to the utilitarianism argument, where you say anything that benefits the whole is good for society, like anything that's like that can help more people, and then you have to ask like why is it that anything that, and it's a circular, and you'll see that this is circular too.
There's a lot of like the railroad track paradox where it's like the train's heading and it's gonna hit like 6 people, but you could pull the switch and then it can instead just hit 1 person. Do you pull the switch? What's the moral thing to do?
And so you run into this problem of like, how do we know that what's good for society is actually good for society? And that's the same tautology that we run into with this idea that anything that's good for the well-being of a person is objective. Because how do we know that anything that's good for the well-being of a person is objective? It's circular thinking. So that's the first problem.
Right.
But I don't want to get too fixated on that. That's just a logical error in his thinking.
Yeah, one thing I want to just comment on really quick is I think a lot of people make people more than other people, and they make actions based upon that. I think it's another human nature thing that we can go into later, like a psychological thing on our podcast. But I just want to point out this is why this is really important that we're talking about this. So.
Okay, so why don't I jump into like the big problem with this? So like, it sounds good. Okay, from face value, it sounds pretty good. Like anything that helps someone is objectively morally good. Right? It sounds good. So where does the problem arise? And so the problem arises when we look at what objective means. And I think that Sam Harris falls victim to not understanding the word objective.
Okay.
So objective means that something must be true in all possible worlds that could exist.
Okay.
So take, for example, a married bachelor. A married bachelor cannot exist in any of the possible worlds that could have existed based on evolution. Okay? Because it's just logically not possible for it to exist.
Right.
So it's true in all possible worlds. And so that is the criteria for something being objective. It must be true in all possible worlds.
Okay.
No matter how we evolved, it was still true.
Okay.
So we start to see a problem with this human flourishing idea, because let's look at some possible worlds that could come into existence.
Okay.
So in our society, we have psychopaths, and we have psychopath serial killers.
Right.
Now, it is possible that our world could become just psychopath serial killers. Okay?
Yeah, I think a lot of people would argue that no, it couldn't, because we'd all be dead and the world would not exist.
Well, it doesn't matter, but it's possible. Like, let's say like the person, there's like one person
who's just
on
really good.
the North America continent and one person on Africa, and like everyone else is dead. Like, it doesn't matter. It's still possible. Okay.
Sure.
So in this world where psychopaths are the only people alive that they like killing, what their behavior does, the stuff that benefits their brain, is much different than the stuff that
benefits
occurs
a normal person. Yeah.
So that right there, we saw a possible world where this is not objective. It's not true.
Yeah.
So we could have like a little society of psychopath killers, and the same things that are true for them that benefit their brain are not true for the rest of society. Thus, it's not objective.
Yeah. So you're saying
it's not objective moral. It's subjective.
Yeah. So you're saying that like when you try to find something that's objective that will benefit all the well-being of all humans, that's just simply very hard to come by, because how different human beings are and how different they could be.
Yeah, so you can't say that just because it benefits someone's brain, it must be objective, because what benefits one person's brain does not benefit another person's brain.
Necessarily.
So it's not necessarily. It
Yeah.
might, but
It
it's
might.
not objective. That's the
Right.
key.
Right.
So that's why Sam Harris is not taken very seriously in the philosophy field because his argument is very easily refuted. And honestly, the argument has been made like countless times over the last thousands of years. So he's just rewriting it in a new format.
So his argument was objective morals can't exist without God.
Yeah,
that's what they are. And you're saying no, they couldn't because objective morals without God, I guess, runs into the problem of too much variability.
Well, his description of it, like, there's other arguments to how you could ground morals without God. Like, one is Platonic morals, like, exist beyond God, and then you run into the whole problem, like, is God liable to laws of morals, or did God define the laws of morals, or is God the laws of morals? And that's another discussion, and I didn't really want to get into that today.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. Just want to recap. Okay.
Yeah. So now that I've shown you why Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris really aren't that good. I want to talk about what are good atheist arguments. So if I am talking to an atheist and I hear these arguments, I have a lot of respect for them because I'm like, these are good arguments. These are things that I have problems with, and I'm sure a lot of Christian philosophers lose sleep overnight over these arguments.
Okay.
The first one I've sort of but don't take it as a reason not to believe in God. I'm just saying that these are strong arguments and the other ones aren't, but they still have answers, and I'll go over the answers to them.
Okay.
So the first argument is the problem of evil and suffering. Okay. So why is it that if a maximally benevolent God, meaning like a really good, kind God, created the world, why do we have so much evil in it? Why do kids die? Why are kids tortured at the age of 4? Couldn't God have fathomed a different world in which the variables prevent that from happening?
Yeah.
And then additionally, like, why do we have like these natural disasters, like earthquakes that kill people? Couldn't he have created Earth without these problems and still have it functioning?
Well, now let me just comment on something really quick. Back to the Sam Harris thing, we were saying that it's very hard to determine objective morals for everyone because everyone's very different. But what might be considered bad for everybody's well-being or evil for everybody's well-being might also be different as well, right? Like, I'm trying to describe how maybe, like, I don't know, if I gave you an injection of like insulin or something, that would be bad for you. Yeah. But for maybe a diabetic patient, it would be good for them.
Yeah.
So I could literally be doing evil for you, but my evil action was actually a good action for somebody else.
That's why you can't base whether something is an objective moral based on the response of the individual receiving that action.
Or, I mean, I guess another scenario is like, back to that railroad track thing, if you pull the switch and you kill, and the train has to end up killing one person instead of 6, you would say, well, was that an evil thing or a good thing? The 6 people are going to say that was a good thing, and one guy's going to say that was a bad thing. You know what I mean? So
yeah, so that's the argument of subjective morals, and that's why it's subjective, not objective. And I hold a lot more respect to people who are willing to admit subjective moral, like to admit that that's their viewpoint, but they shouldn't go around preaching morals then, because they're subjective.
Right.
And so so ultimately you're just showing that we can't call these things objective morals.
But what I'm saying is, when you say like, why is there so much suffering or evil in the world? Mm-hmm. I'm saying that itself might be subjective.
Yeah.
What you attribute to be evil could be a subjective opinion. It could be good for somebody else. It could be
that's
evil
great
for you.
because that's actually an argument that is made, is that that sometimes suffering is necessary for the benefit. Like suffering, like evil, like we can't feel good unless we go through periods where we don't feel good, sort of thing.
Yeah, like
you
can't have good weather
just be happy
if you
all the
don't have
time.
bad weather.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And so that's sort of an argument, and it's one of the ones that you can kind of push.
Interesting.
So why do we have natural disasters that just like earthquakes and volcanoes that just kill people? And I think that this is a pretty strong argument, and it's pretty hard to answer. Now, Alvin Plantinga, my favorite philosopher, actually came up with a refutation for this argument, and since then, this is no longer debated at the academic level.
Okay.
Because the burden of proof was placed on the atheists now. So I'll try to explain this as quickly as I can, but I talked about possible worlds. Possible worlds are anything that could have existed, that could exist had something changed. So, like, yesterday, had you not slept in your bed, then how would the world be different today?
I would have been like really crappy today.
Yeah, something like that. Like, but like when variables change,
yeah.
and the world that could have existed had you done this, that's a possible world. So that's kind of another way to understand the possible world thing.
Right.
So there's one of the big elements you have to remember about this is this idea of free will.
Okay.
So God has to give us free will. Okay. It's important.
Okay, you're saying if God exists, we're saying let's suppose he does give us free will.
Yeah, let's say that God gives us free will because otherwise we're just puppets. Like, what are we to him? We're just puppets that do whatever he says. So God had reason to give us free will. Okay. But giving us free will means that we have the choice between good and bad, which means that some actions will be good and some actions will be bad, which means that
not necessarily.
We could all be good.
We could all do good actions 100% of the time.
But because we have the choice, it doesn't happen.
Right.
So the idea is that God looked at all the possible worlds that he could create, given free will, that he could give people free will in, and then he chose the one that maximally benefited, like reduced suffering, the one with the least amount of suffering and the most people that come to know him. So he looked at different worlds, like this world, like where this would happen and this person would do this, which would cause suffering for this. Another world where this person would do this and this would cause suffering.
And out of all of them, he chose
the best one. So an atheist then has to say that he didn't choose the best one.
Yeah, the atheist says, how do you know he didn't choose the best one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's why the burden of proof is now on the atheist to show that God didn't choose the best one given free will.
Oh wow. Okay. Yeah. Okay,
So
okay.
that's. But I admit
Wow.
though it's a challenging problem, and I think it still is somewhat relevant. But it does have a good refutation to it, and it shouldn't be a reason to not believe in a god.
Okay. Okay. Gotcha.
Okay, so next I'm going to talk about something that I think is a very strong argument for atheism also, but I'll also talk about the refutations to it. But I think that this is a challenging question. So
Okay.
it's the problem of the hiddenness of God. So the idea is like, let's say I wrote some stuff down. Okay, so if God exists,
Yeah.
and he has all this power, then why doesn't he show himself more? Why
Okay.
Why is he so hidden?
Why
and,
is there like not a
unseen?
direct
Yeah.
presence that we can directly observe, like
Yeah.
document, record, evidence based, etc.?
So like in the Bible, you see people say like, here's my dad did like a thing on this. So he did these notes, but like in Psalms 42:3, a person says, "People say to me continually, where is your God?"
Yeah.
And so like all throughout the Bible and stuff, which is one of the religions of theism.
Yeah.
You see people ask like, where is God? Why can't I see him? Why isn't he showing himself to me?
Yeah.
So the question then is, how does a theist deal with this?
Right.
Okay, so one way that we attempt to solve this problem is you say, well, there's epistemic or cognitive distance that's necessary for God
Okay.
between
so
us.
what does that mean?
So basically, for free will to work, for us to have choice, it's important that God doesn't show himself all the time. Because if
Oh.
God shows himself all the time and you know him to exist, then you're just like the devil who knows God exists but doesn't really have a choice in whether or not to
Believe in him.
it.
So you're saying the idea of having faith could not exist if God directly showed himself.
Yeah, and you wouldn't really have much choice in the matter of belief in God because you'd just be expected to believe God if he showed himself more.
Okay.
So then
okay.
that's one argument.
So, but I think a counter argument might be like, well, so what if you don't have faith? Like, you just know he exists.
Yeah, and that's why we need distance. Because
But-
if we all know he exists, then yeah, I mean, I see what you're saying. You're saying like,
Yeah,
well,
so
faith
like-
could be the criteria to get into heaven, not belief in God, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
So you know he exists, but I think that the counter argument is just like why, God wanted to create it so that we would have distance from him and then have more of a choice on our own. So why limit the number of choices that we can have, if that makes sense?
Okay, so it'd be like reducing free will in a way.
Yeah, it'd be in some ways like reducing the power of free will. Does that make sense?
Wow. Okay.
But see, this is again why this is a strong argument.
Yeah, this is a
pretty
debatable.
tough question.
Yeah.
So another argument would be like God has given plenty of examples. When God gives examples of his existence, people still don't believe.
Okay.
So Jesus performed miracles. The Pharisees still didn't believe he was like had power from God, even though
Yeah.
they saw him like heal people.
And honestly, if I saw someone do like something miraculous today, I would like not believe it. I'd be like, oh,
Yeah.
he did some magic trick or some unknown scientific law or
Yeah.
something. Yeah.
So like let's say like in the sky it says God is real. Well, people still might not believe God is real because they could say, well, there's so many universes out there. It's inevitable that the clouds would align in one universe to say that God is real.
Yeah. Right.
And so even if God does show himself more, it doesn't necessarily follow that people would still believe in that he does exist.
Yeah, something that always struck me is that a miracle by definition is something that amazes you because it doesn't like exceed your expectations. It's not what you're expecting. And the thing is that like a lot of people are like, well, a miracle is like when a baby is born or something like that. And I'm
Yeah.
like, well, no, because you expected that to happen.
Yeah.
But I
to
think,
some extent, it's very improbable given all the seamen that attempt to swim to the
Yeah,
uterus.
right.
So it is in
That-
some sense a miracle.
Right.
that
Yeah.
occurred,
Yeah. But I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is that like when something actually exceeds your expectations, given what you know about the laws of physics, then you say, oh well, that I don't know what that was. Maybe it's like a different law, or maybe it was a miracle or something. And I just thought I've always just found that very interesting because.
Yeah.
The next miracle could just literally be you could just adapt to accept that miracle really isn't a miracle. You know what I mean? Like if you see a baby born, you're like, wow, I don't even know how that happens.
But it's
then
not.
like
It's,
yeah, then
it's just because I don't know the answer doesn't
yeah,
mean that.
and then you figure it out, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, it's
Yeah.
not that miraculous.
And
you know?
actually, this gets into an interesting topic. In like, if God exists, how does he interact with the world? Like,
Yeah.
And when you get into quantum mechanics and stuff, and the fact that
Oh my
like
gosh,
a proton can exist in multiple places, it's more
electron.
like a wave. An electron can
And
exist-
proton
Yeah,
too, yeah.
on the micro level, like different micro atoms and stuff don't actually exist anywhere, and it's just they're more probable to exist in a certain place. So
Yeah.
God performing a miracle might just be causing the improbable to happen,
Yeah, and you know,
and not actually changing the laws of physics in order to intervene, but actually just using the laws of physics but creating something improbable.
right. And
and
just to correct you, like we don't mean micro atoms, you just mean like particles. Particles
just
usually
tiny-
make atoms. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
So they follow what we call like a wave-like position, like a wave field theory, so that the probability of them being at a certain spot is a certain percentage, and they could actually be anywhere, but they are only at one place when you actually identify them. It's
So like a horse could just appear out of nowhere, but it's just incredibly improbable.
because there's so many particles that
Yeah.
would compose
Have
a
to
horse.
compose, yeah.
Yeah,
And so that's how God could potentially intervene in the world, is just making the improbable happen, and that's without obstructing the current laws of physics, without changing anything. He
Right.
can intervene.
But then
so that's fascinating.
all of a sudden, though, it would change the probability of that happening because it did happen.
Yeah,
That's
funny. Yeah, that's true. Okay, so like the last thing is that I think the last argument that theists make is like that God does show himself, that we're just blind to see. So let me I actually have a quote. Pascal is famous for the Pascal's wager, which
Yeah.
is basically the idea that it's a better bet to believe in God because the rewards that could follow is like you go to heaven or you just die. But if you don't believe in God, you like just go to hell or something.
Yeah.
So it's a wager, but I don't want to get into that right now because I want to finish this.
Okay.
But Pascal said, God has given evidence that is sufficiently clear to those with an open heart. Those seeking God will find the evidence. So it's the idea that God is obvious through creation, like through the fact that we are like incredibly intelligent beings that have formed on this earth, and that there's so much aesthetic beauty like around us. It's obvious to anyone with an open heart that God created the world.
But that's more of an emotional argument, I would say, right?
It's in a sense, it's an emotional argument.
Because the only way you can appreciate beauty is if it sparks an emotion in you.
Yeah. So yeah, in a sense, it's an emotional argument.
Right.
And that's why this is like if God is real, then these are legitimate responses. But if God is not real, then these are illogical. So there's a lot of arguments that if God is real, then it makes sense that this to be true. But if God is not, it doesn't.
Yeah.
And so that's a whole area of study in philosophy that I don't want to get into.
Okay. So
so let me just read a couple of quotes that I think kind of lament the idea I'm trying to bring across.
Okay.
So in Paul's view, God's properties, his external power and deity, are clearly revealed in creation, so that people who fail to believe in an eternal, powerful creator of the world are without excuse. Indeed, Paul says that they actually know that God exists, but they suppress this truth because of their unrighteousness. As a result, they become so clouded in their thinking that they may actually deceive themselves into thinking that they are open-minded inquirers, honestly pursuing the truth. The human capacity for rationalization and self-deception, I'm sure we've all observed, is very great indeed, and in the biblical view, atheists are prey to it. So this is the idea that the reason why it's not evident to us that God exists is because we are sinners, and we want to rationalize our sin and be allowed to do it. So we purposely deceive ourselves and suppress the knowledge that's available. And so this is a religious point of view on this. And like I said, for this to be true, God has to exist.
And who said that? Who's
well, this is William Lane Craig who said this, but he's taking segments of Paul's work in the
Paul's a character in the Bible.
A character.
Yeah, so sorry.
A person in the Bible.
Yeah, you can tell how well versed I am.
I'm just kidding.
Literally, but yeah.
So another quote that kind of illustrates that, and I want to end on this quote, is the most serious noetic effects of sin have to do with our knowledge of God. Were it not for sin and its effects, God's presence and glory would be as obvious and uncontroversial to us as all the presence of other minds, physical objects, and the past. Our knowledge of his character and love towards us can be smothered. It can even be transformed into a resentful thought that God is to be feared and mistrusted. It may see him as indifferent and even malignant. Oh my gosh, sorry.
Great with that.
Sorry, it's hard to read while I'm like doing a podcast. But basically, the last perspective is just to add to the idea that the reason why it's not obvious to us that God exists is because we're clouded with like sin, and that we want to continue doing sinful activities, and we're self-righteous in the fact that we think that what we're doing is right, and we want to be God and believe that our thoughts are right and that his aren't. So that's what I want to end on.
Okay.
And hopefully you guys have been able to follow this. Like, I realize that if you haven't studied philosophy or theology, you may get stuck on some of these places, but realize too that I've spent a considerable amount of time learning this stuff, and like some of these arguments took me weeks to really understand.
Okay, gotcha.
And so maybe I'll do another podcast on this topic, but I want to conclude with Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris are not good philosophers. If you want to be an atheist, then hold good arguments. And I think your good arguments are the problem of evil, the problem of hiddenness of God, but realize that like there are strong arguments against these arguments.
Yeah, okay.
There are good refutations.
Good arguments on both sides.
Yeah, so if you're going to hold it, at least be agnostic because you recognize that they are strong.
Okay. All right, anyways, all right, well, thanks, guys. Stay tuned for other podcasts. Thanks.